NBA trade season has officially begun, ladies and gentlemen. I love this time of year, all the rumors, speculation. We get to see which players are on the move, which ones remain, which teams won the trade, all of that. And there is always that one trade that has to kick everything off before the domino of trades fall prior to the deadline. And that trade has finally happened for the NBA. Yes, we obviously got the James Harden trade to the Clippers earlier in the year, but that really had to happen ASAP for the Sixers, who needed to get rid of Harden at all cost and as soon as possible. But for the most part, trade season really doesn't start kicking off until sometime between mid-December and early January, partially because a lot of players throughout the league aren't trade eligible until around that time if they most recently signed an extension or signed with a new team. But right before the start of the new year, the Toronto Raptors, who have been struggling to develop any kind of consistent winning dating all the way back to last season, have finally made a big trade and moving on from their two-way talent OG Anunoby to the New York Knicks in exchange for Barrett, Immanuel Quickley, and a second-round pick. More details included in that trade, which I'll discuss more in a little bit. But the discourse on Twitter, Reddit, what have you, is who won this trade. And you actually have a pretty polarizing response across fans saying the Raptors clearly won this trade and fleeced the Knicks, while others are saying the Knicks won this trade hands down. Well, let's dive into it further and see who truly benefited the most from this transaction. But first, a quick word from the sponsor of this video, Underdog Fantasy. If you haven't heard of Underdog, let me tell you about their platform real quick, because I absolutely love this app and it's super easy to use. And if you're like me and you like making predictions, even if they're potentially bad ones, and maybe want to make a little money on the side, my personal favorite that I use on the app is NBA Pick'ems. They have higher or lowers on most player stats for any game. Just pick higher or lower on a given player stat for their upcoming game, and you can win up to 20 times your money in a single night if you do 5 Pick'ems and you get them all right. And guys, they're offering viewers of this channel an exclusive offer. If you use the promo code AND1HOOPS, all one word, you'll get your first deposit doubled up to $100. Who doesn't want free money, right? It's really that easy. I'll leave a link to the site and the code in the description if you're interested, and let me know what picks you guys end up making. Now, first and foremost, I don't really like this notion of determining who quote-unquote won a given trade literally right after it's completed, because one, we often don't know all of the behind-the-scenes factors, like a player being disgruntled or making it clear they had no intention on re-signing with their team. Sometimes that comes out after the fact, which would thus impact said team's leverage. So while it may seem like they got fleeced based on the final terms of the deal, if they knew they were going to lose a given player and had very little leverage to work with, getting anything in return could be considered a win. 2, it's really hard to say who won a given trade until we really see the results of the trade, which sometimes don't yield until years after the fact, especially when multiple future draft picks are involved in a deal. But regardless, based on the information we have now, what we know of the players included in this trade, how should we be grading the trade for each of the teams? Now, for the Knicks, a team that is good, a playoff team, went to the second round last season, won their first playoff series in over a decade. They recently brought in Jalen Brunson, who has been a huge piece for them in their success. But as good as the Knicks are, I don't think anyone would consider them to be title contenders, nor are they on the cusp of contention as they are currently constructed. And for the Knicks, fortunately for them, they actually have a lot of trade assets to work with in the form of draft capital and young talent. But young talent, they know they're not going to be able to afford to keep all of them around for the long term. And when I look at a team like the Knicks, a team that is solid on offense, top 10 in the league in offensive rating, they've got some great scores, but in a way, almost too many scores between Brunson, Randall, and Barrett. Not enough basketballs to go around for all those guys to get their touches. And Barrett and Randall oftentimes way too inconsistent and inefficient scores, and the fit between them in the lineup hasn't always worked. And for the Knicks, a team that is pretty average on the defensive end and don't really have those guys on the roster that give them a strong defensive edge in the starting lineup, adding a two-way player like OG, who is a hustler on both ends of the floor, makes them much more dynamic than someone like Barrett. And while Barrett, yes, is younger, in my opinion, I feel like we know who RJ is as a player. This isn't a situation of a player who has this insanely high ceiling and untapped potential. I just really don't see Barrett getting any better than he currently is. I don't see him becoming an all-star in the NBA, but a solid starter who can be a scoring spark as a third or fourth option on offense. And so while I hear some people saying that OG Anunoby and Barrett are really interchangeable players, or that trading those guys really cancels each other out for both teams, no. OG Anunoby is the best player in this trade. He's the most impactful player in the trade overall because of what he brings on both ends of the floor. And so while I don't think that OG Anunoby is a star level player, he's a talent that impacts winning on the court and is super underrated. And while OG is playing on the final year of his deal, He has a player option next season, but I imagine he's going to decline that to become a free agent and get a bigger deal. I see it being much more likely of a scenario that the Knicks are able to extend him being in a big market and on a better team than where he's currently at. And even though the Knicks are probably going to have to overpay for him, it's a move that's needed for a team that is trying to be a contender now and likely isn't done yet in terms of future transactions happening leading up to the trade deadline. Like, this isn't their only move. And I wouldn't be shocked if they use all of their draft picks to try and bring in a bona fide star to put alongside Brunson. They got to get rid of Randall, though. That team really won't be thriving and being a contender while Randall is still on that team. But we'll save that for now. Oh, and I do think it's worth noting that Precious Achiuwa and Malachi Flynn were included in this deal to send to the New York Knicks, which I feel like most people are sweeping that under the rug like it's just filler. No, those are two decent role players that can actually give the Knicks some depth off the bench, which they've needed. Here's what gets me though, the Raptors. I like that they're finally starting to make moves because the roster they had reached its climax a long time ago. They needed to make changes, and keeping this roster thinking they were suddenly going to turn things around would have been insane. But if you're the Raptors, well, I'm not saying this is a terrible move. I do question what they're trying to do here, because the Raptors are a prime team based on where they are in the standings, likely a lottery team as constructed. The best course of action for them is to blow it up and go on a fire sale for some of the biggest assets, OG Anunoby being one of them. And while I get that they didn't have the best leverage in this situation, knowing that OG likely was going to opt out of his player option and would not be re-signing with the team, at the same time though, Anunoby was one of the more coveted players in the trade market last season, where there were talks of teams wanting OG Anunoby for multiple first-round picks, and the Raptors wanting 3 picks, first-round picks, to get him. And yes, his trade value has gone down since then. But the fact that the Raptors weren't able to get a single first-round pick in the deal, the fact that they brought in a player who is young, but again, I feel has more or less hit his ceiling, but is also a player on a near-max deal with 4 years left on his contract. And then Immanuel Quickley, who I actually like and think he has more potential for the future, but also a player that is going to be a restricted free agent, and there is some risk of potentially losing him if some team offers him a deal that is too rich for the Raptors to match. And so I guess for me, it's this case of the Raptors and wanting to rebuild or retool, but they're almost kind of half-assing it. If you're going to blow it up, blow it up. Don't try and bring in players who don't really move the needle for you just because they're younger. Now, to be fair, though, this isn't that bad of a deal for the Raptors because, again, they would have likely lost OG for nothing, and now you have 2 young players who want bigger roles on offense, 2 players who may thrive in a new environment and give a struggling team some energy, but at the end of the day, how does this really help the Raptors long term? How do Barrett and Quickley really move the needle for them? And these aren't 2 young players that are going to become franchise-level players, nor are they players that are even franchise cornerstones that you can use to help build around. For the Raptors, if you're going to tear it down, do it right. Don't try and still hang on to trying to win now and adding talent on the margins. Now, yes, the Raptors might not be done. There are reports that are saying they're still looking to move Siakam before the deadline, who is on an expiring contract and likely isn't going to fit their overall timeline. And if you're able to get a return or a decent return that is more in line with the rebuilding approach, i.e. take on expiring money to match Siakam, but acquiring some draft capital that makes this trade a little more understandable. But for the Raptors, I just don't really see what the end goal is here with this roster. Obviously, Masai Ujiri is a talented GM, and I'm sure he has something up his sleeve, but it does make me question what the ultimate goal is here for this roster. Now, I will admit, part of the reason I'm more down on this trade for the Raptors over the Knicks is because I am a bit lower on RJ Barrett than most. I just don't think his game impacts winning as much as some like to think. Very streaky shooter, not that efficient overall. His three-point shooting has gotten worse over time. He's average at best on defense. Like, there really isn't anything he does exceptionally well. And I don't think going to a new environment is suddenly going to change that. And because I'm not that high on Barrett, I can't get over that contract that the Raptors decided to take on where he's still owed over $100 million over the next 3.5 seasons. But overall, I can see how this trade on the whole works out for both sides. This isn't a situation where I would give the Raptors an F and the Knicks an A, or that any team got fleeced in the deal. But I would lean more towards the Knicks in getting the better end of this trade, mainly because they made it clear Quickley wasn't going to be part of their long-term plans. They got out of it. And in my opinion, they also got out of a bad contract with RJ Barrett and upgraded with OG Anunoby, who fits their roster. Fits exactly the type of player Tom Thibodeau loves. And for the Raptors, they're already not that good. But they're also not bad enough to really take full advantage of a rebuild. And adding these 2 players just further perpetuates that. So if I had to give each team a grade for this transaction, I'm giving the Knicks an A- and the Raptors a B-. But I would love to hear what your opinion and grades are for this trade. Let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.